Scripture. When God speaks about His relationship with Israel, He says, I'm the husband and Israel is the wife. And what do we know about this relationship? Well, there's a problem with it. That covenant, by the way, marriage is a covenant. What we find is that covenant relationship becomes far removed what it should be. And what's the solution? The solution is redemption. So he's speaking here about this couple, and at their wedding, they ran out of wine. That would be a shameful thing. What should he tell us? Well, it's telling us that when a marriage fails, it's a shameful thing. Why? It is a covenant. A marriage is supposed to be used as a vessel to manifest God's glory. It is to reveal this covenant relationship that man is supposed to have with God. And when the people of God, they have trouble in marriage, and that marriage ends, well, it is a shameful thing. I was very much pleased to hear there was this celebrity, and he was being interviewed, and he was asked the question, what's the greatest failure in your life? And he said, the ending of my first marriage. Now, this man, I came to find out, was a believer, and he understood that marriage is a responsibility. It has a purpose, and his first marriage failed, and he was grieved over that. So, same situation here. They ran out of wine. Notice what it says, middle of verse 3. And the mother of Yeshua says to him, they have no wine. Meaning, do something. But here's the important truth. Notice how Yeshua responds. He says to her, what is this to you and me? This, he says later on, he says, woman, and by the way, this term woman is a term of utmost respect. So when he says, what is this to me and to you, woman, he's not saying this in a way that lacks respect. It is a term, in English, for example, we might say the term ma'am. It's a term of respect. He's simply saying, this is not my role. Furthermore, he says, my time has not yet come. So he's saying, this is not why I've come into the world. It's not for the purpose of what? For the purpose of solving these problems. I have a greater purpose, and it's the outcome of that purpose that in the end will solve problems like this. So he makes this statement, but we read on in verse 5, his mother says to the servants, whatever he should say to you, you do. So in this we see Mary, his earthly mother, taking charge of everything that's going on. She's saying to the servants, whatever he should say, you do. Now, here again, Mary is taking the prevalent role. Why? This is all about redemption. Whenever a woman takes the main role, it gives the context, that of redemption, for the reader. And notice what happens. It says, and there was there 6 jars, stone jars of water that were laid there for the purification, and it's a ritual of the Jewish people. Now, I want you to see how important what we're learning is, because it talks about Jewish tradition. And here again, many people that study and teach this passage, they just skip over that fact. Let's take it very slowly. The first thing that we see is that there is 6, and that number is important. Why? Because 6 in Hebrew numerology has to do with grace. There's always a connection, an inherent relationship between grace and redemption. Without grace, there can be no redemption. So there's 6, not just by chance, the providence of God. There were arranged there, that means it was purpose, that there be 6 stone jars, and these contain water for the purification of the Jewish people, meaning a purification tradition, a law that they had. And why is that so important? Because he's going to use that in bringing about his first miracle. He is going to change water into wine. Now, we all know this, but here's what I want you to see concerning this truth. this passage and what he wants to reveal to the reader. Yeshua, we've already talked about, is God. The scripture says, with God, all things are possible. So if the issue was simply, let's get them wine, Messiah could have done that many different ways. He could have just spoken and said, look, there's more wine. And they could have gone back and said, I don't know how we've missed it, but there's additional wine here. Never said anything to himself, if that was the case. He could have created the need and the action so that servants just knocked on the door and said, here's a delivery of more wine. Here again, maybe they thought it was already arranged. So there would be an endless amount of ways that Yeshua could cause there to be additional wine at that place. The fact that he did it in the way that he did is great, has great significance. Now, there are those 6 stone jars that what? That were there for the purification ritual. What is that? Well, when a woman, and we're going to get very specific here, when a woman enters into an age where she becomes a woman and she has that monthly menstruation cycle, with the first one, she has a change in status. What is that change in status? She becomes known as a nida. That word nida has to do with impurity. And because of that, she cannot be touched by a man. So she is in a state which she is forbidden. But what happens? On the night before she's married, they take that water from those jars and they put it in what's known as a mikveh, which is very similar to a baptismal. And she immerses. And what happens? Just like we talked about. The baptism has to do with a change of status. She goes from that which is forbidden to becoming that which is permissible. And it is the basis for what? For a man taking a wife. She has to be in this new status, this new condition. So it's very significant that Yeshua, he chose in order to meet the need of a lack of wine, which is synonymous with a lack of love, a lack of joy. What happens? He significantly chose this means in order to provide the wine. Why? To teach us. It is only through him that there can be a change that brings about a relationship that was one of lacking, one that was insufficient, now to a relationship that is synonymous with love and joy. So let's read what happens. We find that Yeshua says to the servants, verse 7, and Yeshua said to them, fill up the water jars. And they filled them up to the very top. And he says, take them, or literally draw up the water now, and take it to the chief of the banquet. And they did. Verse 9. And when the chief of the banquet, this was the one that was responsible for everything. We read here, when the chief of the banquet, he tasted the water that had become wine, although he did not know from where it was from, but the servants, they knew, the ones who had brought the water, that it had been transformed. What happens? Notice what he does. This one who had the responsibility, any time that wine was opened up and given, what would he do? He would taste it first. He had done this thousands of times in his life, and probably none of them ever surprised him like this time. But what do we read here? Look again. We find that when he had tasted this wine that had become, this water that had become wine, he called, middle of verse 10, he called to the bridegroom, that is the chief of this banquet, and he said to them, how is it that all men first they bring out the good wine, and when they have become drunk, then the inferior wine? So that's the norm. Now what's it trying to tell us here? That's how most people's lives go when they get married. It's the highest, the joy, the happiness, the contentment, what they feel as far as love. It's at the very beginning. But as time goes on,